In 1986, comedians like Stephen Fry, Billy Connolly, Rowan Atkinson walked through this door here and performed the very first Comic Relief. 10 years later, Comic Relief and Red Nose Day were getting a bit mixed up, and so they approached the team so that we could help them with their brand. We caught up with our old client Bill Gosbee and our ex-CEO Julian Grice to find out how that happened.
Thanks for coming into the team to talk about Comic Relief. Cast our minds back.
I know, totally.
How did it all start for you at Comic Relief? What got you involved in Comic Relief?
At the time, sort of fundraising and sort of charity giving was a fairly dull exercise for most people, and Comic Relief really came along and shook all that up. So not only did it shake up how people fundraised, it also shook up how they spent their money. They tackled subjects that others wouldn't do, and also started that sort of micro financing across Africa that hadn't existed before. So charity was, we will give you money and impose what we want you to do. Comic Relief came at that very differently, and it was, how can we help you develop your lives where you're from, and that was a very different take on charity at the time.
Because you'd come from charity, hadn't you? We'd met at a previous charity.
Yeah, so I was working for Marie Curie Cancer Care. Obviously, national institution, but it was very traditional and a very traditional way of raising money. There wasn't much fun about. It was a very sort of dour experience.
Now, when we started, we did this bit of work which I dug out of the archive the other day, which is the Marie Curie Daffodil.
Yeah, I remember
because
that.
there is a kind of interesting thing about how charities have a sort of focal point, isn't there? So Comic Relief, and we'll come on to it, but Comic Relief had the kind of focal point of Red Nose Day.
Yes, absolutely.
So you had Daffodil Day.
Marie Curie's Daffodil Day had been around for quite some time, but again, getting people out to pick up their daffodils was getting harder and harder.
Yes.
As people had other things to do. You're right. We came up with this campaign that again sort of tried to modernise it a bit, and I think it did a great job.
Daffodil Day was an interesting one because I think it wasn't really a recognised, such a big national event as Red Nose Day, but it had all the kind of, it had community involvement and lots of local activity and all that kind of thing that charities do, which is kind of giving ownership to people at a local level, but trying to produce a kind of umbrella campaign that they could all buy into. And
yes, I mean the volunteers were in the hundreds of thousands. It wasn't a small operation. So again, trying to galvanise that into one kind of cohesive day,
yes,
wasn't easy. Very traditional audience in terms of those people going out collecting. So actually, this campaign was very new to them, but they embraced it. I think everyone loved the campaign.
Do you remember why you wanted to work this again at Comic Relief?
And I think what struck me about the team was the passion you had for the detail of the subject matter, and that's fairly unusual because I think most agencies will give a sort of cursory look and then delve straight into the creative. But I think you were always very keen to really get to the detail, which then meant that actually the work was always effective rather than it just being a nice piece of work.
Right. And we had a sense of humour, I suppose. That's quite important for
sort of, yeah.
Sort of sense of humour. Well,
sometimes.
It's quite.
No, you did. So it was. So
yeah.
I think there were. Again, I think that connection rather than it just being a sort of client relationship matters. And I think if you can transcend that, you end up with much better work.
The team at that point, we're talking kind of early 90s, was really beginning to focus on work with a kind of social purpose. Yeah. And we focused a lot on third sector work as well as public services work. So I think that kind of genuine interest in what the business model was and how what the charity was setting out to achieve. It was part of the sort of DNA of the business at the time, rather than just well, let's look for a bit of charity work.
Yeah.
That's going
and you're right, that was unusual.
Get in a D&AD annual or something, which is, what often the motivation for agencies working in the charity field is a bit of creative kudos, which it certainly provides. I mean, Comic Relief provided that kudos, and freedom, but then that was kind of the problem, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So kind of where the job started was because things were a bit out of control.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges at Comic Relief, because of their business model, was that they didn't use any of the money raised to pay for their operating costs. We had zero budget. So having come from another charity where there was money for marketing, there was zero money. So effectively, I had to go out and ask people to donate their time.
And the first one we got into was Debt Wish. You asked us to come and check out, this one, and it was going to be big, wasn't it, from memory? I mean, here it is in the guidelines.
It seemed quite insignificant there, but I think it was to get the G20 to write off all of Africa's debt. Small ask, yes.
Yeah.
When we started working through it, we realised we had a slightly bigger issue. Like most charities, you have your charity day. For Comic Relief, that was 8 hours of BBC telly. The difficulty for Comic Relief was that you had a massive event that overshadowed the sort of master brand itself.
Here's the evidence of the prosecution, as it were.
Yes.
20 odd pages of rules and regulations for highly creative people. That was really what this project, I guess, was about, was a kind of cultural sort of behaviour change piece of work to try and get incredibly bright people in lots of different situations channeling their energy into a better product for Comic Relief. How do we set about that? Because the kind of the word guidelines inflicts kind of terror into creative folk, and most of the time, doesn't it? And it's about freedom within constraints. I guess we had to have maximum freedom within minimum constraints.
Well, I think the brief started out as guidelines in their sort of more traditional form, and I think we then realised we had an opportunity to really bring out the Comic Relief brand personality, which hopefully would then inspire creatives and marketing teams in third-party organisations to not only get it right when they did do stuff, but to push the envelope and do something that they may not necessarily have done within their own brand constraints.
Did you have to sell that idea in to Richard Curtis and the leadership team?
Yes, and a sort of level of disinterest from people like Richard. That's not really their arena.
Yeah.
He makes films and great TV shows. This kind of detail other people do. But actually, what happened was once we showed the initial ideas, everyone got excited because they could actually see it was a great piece of work.
Look, so there were a couple of ideas. I think there's you wanted to explore, I suppose, the kind of how adventurous they would be. There was a route the agencies would always call the kind of back pocket route, the safe one in case everything gets thrown out. But actually, what was great was that you'd engineered a kind of situation and an acceptance that some kind of rules were needed, that people accepted the most adventurous approach, and this was it, which was all centred around the stars of Comic Relief, the face of Comic Relief in the public. Tell us how you kind of set about persuading people or not that was going to work.
I think going back to the pitch, you weren't sure either. I think you had this as we've come up with this idea, but we don't know whether you can involve or whether all these people would be happy to be involved. I wasn't sure, but I certainly thought it was the best idea on the table, so took it back, and spoke to our CEO, who said absolutely, as long as you get sign off from them, I'm sure they'll be happy to be involved. But one thing he did say is you need to make sure that if you're writing stuff for them, it needs to be in their tone, otherwise they won't sign stuff off.
Sure.
So that gave us then the challenge of how do we write like all these very famous, funny people.
Yeah, I suppose what was interesting about Comic Relief at that particular moment was it was clearly a very disruptive brand, because that was the mission it was on. What it needed was professionalisation, I guess. It needed a way of just creating more coherence and a bit more structure about how it operated without losing the freedom to be disruptive.
Yeah, so I think agencies need a license to be disruptive, but actually you can only do that if the client is up for doing it. And actually if you can get yourselves in that comfortable client agency relationship position where you're both comfortable to go for it, that's where you get by far the best results.
I mean, that's the kind of essence of a great client agency relationship. It's kind of mutual trust, isn't it? I mean, you're both kind of pushing for the same thing. So it's been quite an interesting journey for Comic Relief, I suppose, Bill. You're looking back at it now. You've had a number of roles since then. Do you keep an eye on what's going on? Do you think they're as brave today as they were then in terms of what they're trying to do?
I think they try to be, but I think when you become a sort of national institution, national treasure, I think it's hard to be as edgy as you were. And also the landscape has changed. If you think all there was before was telly, and now there's a whole plethora of things, so it's diluted, not as many people watch the show, and you've got to get to people through other channels like all other brands, and that's sort of much harder with what they do to get the same level as cut through.
Right.
But I think fortunately they're still bringing in the same amount of money, so it's still as effective.
And I guess this job is merely symbolic of what all brands wrestle with, which is a business challenge of pushing the creativity, but maintaining the continuity and the clarity to give people confidence in what's going on. And certainly, it's still a standout charity in that context, isn't it?
Well, I think standout brand. If you think think of brands in the UK, it's often on that list of.
Yeah. Well, it's been really interesting. It's been quite challenging to remember everything.
It was a while ago.
Thanks for jumping on the ferry and coming to see us.
Thank you.
It was fun.